East Coast. And good evening for Elaheh, who's actually in Iran right now. And we're doing this during her vacation, so sorry about that. I didn't know when we were scheduling. Today, Elaheh is going to give us some ideas about her learning with less labels or learning with fewer labels work that she has been doing throughout her PhD and throughout her postdoc at Brown. She's currently at Brown as a postdoc researcher. And Elaheh finished her bachelor's in computer science and mathematics and computer science from Amir Kabir University in Iran in 2006. And then in 2011, she finished her master's from the Department of Engineering, Science, and Research branch of the Islamic Azad University in Tehran. And then she finished her PhD in 2019 from the Computer Science Department at Virginia Tech. Since then, Elaheh has been a postdoc at Brown. And Elaheh is also, I would say, a collaborator in a sense on the Learning with Less Labels DARPA program. She is actually part of the Brown team, which, and ISI also has a team led by Aram on that program. And Elaheh is going to talk about her work in that domain. Elaheh, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for your kind words. So hi, my name is Elaheh, and thank you for being here and listening to me. So my main research theme is about learning with less dependency on labeled data. So basically in this theme, I had my research during my PhD, and the topic was cyberbullying detection with weakly supervised machine learning. And during my postdoc, I was working on image classification with less labeled data. So first of all, I will go over my research, PhD research, and then I will explain my postdoc research. So my PhD thesis was about weakly supervised machine learning for cyberbullying detection in social media. So what is cyberbullying? Actually, cyberbullying is bullying that take place in social media and electronic devices such as, for example, cell phones or social media platforms or text message. So there are many forms of cyberbullying, but in this research, we just focus on offensive and negative comments. There are some other forms like name calling, rumor spreading, threat, or public shaming. So it's very, it has many side effects. So for example, it links to mental health issues, and in some extreme cases, depression or suicide happens. And the bad thing about this is that it can happen anytime, it's persistent, and everyone can do that. So as a background motivation, so if you look at some statistics, based on some statistics in 2017, around 67% of the adults under the age of 30, they have cyberbullying experience or online harassment experience from less severe to more severe ones. So it's a very severe and severe issue, and scientists need to address and take steps in order to address these issues. So there are so many challenges for cyberbullying in using machine learning. So in many machine learning methods use supervised methods. So for example, they have labeled social media interaction, and they're using that labeled data, they train a supervised method, and then in order to predict. But the main challenge is that annotation is not easy. So for example, if you have a social media consists of millions of data, how you can just label these amount of data? So it's costly, it's and actually so you need to consider the social interaction. It's not just about the message. The other issue is that language is changing. So for example, if there are some new slangs that nowadays they are bullying, but previously there was not. So and the other way around. So we need to consider the social structure, and we need to have a scalable algorithm for massive data. So this is a big framework, our method, weakly supervised cyberbullying. So in our method, we don't use any labeled data. We have a small seed of offensive words, and using our framework, which has two learner or two classifier that help each other, they predict or we assign the bullying score to social media. So first of all, I will talk about the first method, which is participant vocabulary consistency. So in this method, for each social media interaction, for each user, we assign a bully and victim score. Bully score indicates the tendency of the user to bully other users, and victim score indicates the tendency of the user to be victim by the other users. And for each engram or word, we assign the vocabulary score. So it shows the tendency of the word to be indicative of the bullying. And then we have a small seed of offensive or negative words, and they have the highest bullying score. And we train the model, and we learn the bully and victim score and the vocabulary score using this regularized objective function. So in our objective function, we have the regularizer that I showed with the blue color, and we have the small seed of offensive words, that these offensive words are provided by the experts, and they have the consistency loss. So the consistency loss, actually, we add in each social media message, we add the Boolean score of the sender plus the victim score of the receiver, and we called it the participant score. And then we have the vocabulary score for each word in the message. So the basic idea is that we want to optimize the consistency between the participant score and the vocabulary score. So here is the big picture of the objective function, but and we want to train or learn these Boolean score, victim score, and the word score for the words in the messages. But this objective function is not jointly convex, but it will be convex. It's just we optimize only one parameter at a time. So that's why we use the alternating least square. So in the alternating least square, the basic idea is that we fix all of the parameters except one, and we optimize each parameter in isolation using closed form solution. And we run this until convergence. So here is the algorithm for the PVC. So first of all, we initialize Boolean and victim score and W score, for example, by some defaults, and then in the next step, in the loop four, we fix V and W and then update B. After updating B, we fix P and W and update V using closed form solution. And we actually run this process until convergence. So the output of this algorithm is the learned Boolean, victim, and vocabulary score. So after we learned that we want to assign the Boolean score for the message. So for the Boolean score for the message is the summation of the Boolean score of the sender plus and the victim score of the receiver and the average of the vocabulary score. So here is the Boolean score for each message. And we need to evaluate the method. So for our experiment, we evaluate the method on 3 social media data, Twitter, Instagram, and Ask.fm. We ourselves collected the Twitter data set using Twitter API. So that's why our Twitter data is not huge, but we got some Ask.fm and Instagram from some other researchers. And we collected the bullying score offensive words from a web page, which is nostoring.com. So far we didn't find any weakly supervised method in order to compare our method against majority of the methods for cyberbullying detection were supervised. So we came up with some baselines. So the first one and the most straightforward is seed words. So it means that we compute the bullying score based on the fraction of the seed words in the message. And then we have the co-occurrence. It means that we assign the bullying score based on the concentration of the words that co-occur with the seed words. The other more advanced one is the dynamic co-expansion, in which we we consider the co-occurrence as well as the frequency. And then we have the naive participation baseline. So in the naive participation, for each user, we assign bully and victim score, and we have the vocabulary score. So we compute the bully score based on the fraction of the outgoing messages that contain at least one seed words, and the same way for the victim score. So naive participation is kind of a very strong baseline for our framework. So in order to analyze our framework, for each method, we extract top 100 conversations that most likely to be bullying, and we ask some annotators from Amazon Mechanical Turks to say that if this is a bullying conversation or they are not, this is not a bullying conversation. And then if the majority of the annotators believe that this is a bullying conversation, we assign it as a bullying conversation, and then we compute the precision at K. Precision at K is the proportion of top K conversation detected by the method, and majority of the annotators believe that bullying conversation. So the higher, the better. So here's an example that we show the annotators to label this conversation as bullying or not bullying, or if they are not uncertain about that. So here are the results for the Twitter dataset. So we see that PVC, actually, our method has higher precision at K comparing all the baselines. And this is happening for Ask.fm data, so social media data, but for the Instagram, we realized that naive participation actually is doing better than PVC. And when we actually look at the extracted conversation about PVC, we realized that there are so many long conversation, and annotators, they were not much patient, and they didn't read the whole conversation. So the bullying was happening at the middle or at the end of the conversation, and we thought that maybe annotators didn't read the conversation fully. And the other actual idea is that some people were bullying because they were fan of a celebrity, like they were fan of Justin Bieber, and annotators believe that this is not bullying conversation, but we think that because there were some toxic words in this conversation, it could be a bullying messages. So there are some examples of this detection. So for example, we have some false positives. So there are some offensive and negative words, but the people are just discussing about the issue. They are not bullying each other. Or for example, there are some complicated interactions that PVC was able to detect, but other baseline were not able to detect these kind of complicated interaction. So far I just explained about our primary method. Before actually going to the next step, I want to ask if you have any question for the PVC. Otherwise, I can continue. Okay, seems that there are no questions. So in the participant vocabulary consistency, we use the simple linear classifier for users and messages. But in the next step, we wanted to generalize PVC in order to benefit from nonlinear classifiers. So first of all, before explaining the method, I will just briefly explain about the word embedding and node embedding. So in the word embedding, we map words to the vectors of real numbers. In machine learning method, we use word embedding for strings. So there are some frequency-based methods like count vector or TF-IDF, and there are some prediction-based in which they assign, so they are similar to language model. They assign probability to the sequence of the sentence. So in the right picture, actually, I showed some word embedding. So in which we map the words to the vector of real number in two-dimensional vector. So there is some issue with this actually map that I will go over later in the future slides. But this is the basic idea for the word embedding, in which we we map the words to the vectors, and then we have the node embedding. So similar to word embedding, in the node embedding, we want to map the nodes in the social media or any graph to the vector of real number. So node to vec is for the time I was doing my research. So node to vec was popular those days, but nowadays there are more advanced versions of node embedding. But the node to vec is inspired from the from skip graph. So they wanted to represent the graph as a sequence of the nodes, similar to the document that is the sequence of the words. But the problem with the node embedding is that how you define the neighbors, because it's not linear as documents. So they define two notions of node neighborhood. So they define the communities that the node belongs to using a BFS. And the other notion of neighborhood is the structural equivalence. So for example, in this graph, U and V, they can be considered as neighbors, and U and S can be considered as neighbors. And they actually interpolate between BFS and DFS using flexible bias random walk. So the reason that we use the node to vec is that we assume that Bully users, they could have similar structure. So that's why we use node to vec. And actually in our experiment, we got pretty good results using node to vec. So now, so here's the big picture of our Cochrane Ensemble framework. So in our framework, we have two types of classifier. We have the message classifier and the user classifier. So the input of the message classifier is the message, and the output is the score indicating if the message is an example of harassment or not. So the input of the user classifier is the pair of the user, and the score is the indicating whether the user is harassing the other user or not. And then we have the loss function. How we define the loss? We have two types of loss. One is the consistency loss, and the other is the weak supervision loss. So the consistency loss is basically penalize the disagreement between the message classifier and the user classifier. So they should be consistent. Otherwise, we penalize the model, the objective function. And we have the weak supervision loss, which is over the message classifier. So the basic idea for the weak supervision loss is that we define two seeds. One is the harassment indicator. So they are offensive words, and they define the lower bound for the message classifier. And then we have the harassment counter indicator. So they are the seed words that consist of positive meaning words like thanks, nice, beautiful, or something like that. So, and they define the upper bound. And then we have the weak supervision loss. So in order to show how we penalize based on the weak supervision loss, so for example, we have the Boolean score based on the message classifier. So if the message contained a lot of negative meaning words, the score of the message classifier shouldn't be lower than the lower bound. Otherwise, we penalize the objective function. In the same way, if the message classifier contains a lot of positive meaning words, the score shouldn't be very high. If it's higher than the upper bound, so here I show this threshold, we penalize the objective function. So there are so many classifiers that we can use for the message and for the user classifiers. So for the message classifier, we use bag of word and pre-trained doc2vec. It means that pre-trained doc2vec, it means that we have the social media data and we pre-train based on doc2vec, and for each message, we have a pre-trained fixed vector. And for the user classifier, we have the pre-trained node2vec. It means that for our social media, we pre-train based on the node2vec, and for each user, we have a pre-trained vector, fixed vector. And while we are optimizing the objective function, we are just optimizing the parameter of the classifiers. But we have the custom trained embedding for the word embedding. It means that while we are training the objective function and training the classifiers parameters, we are learning the embedding of the words in an end-to-end manner while we're optimizing the objective function. So the same way for the custom trained embedding, it means that we initialize the embedding of the users, and while we're optimizing the objective function, we are training or learning the vectors for the users. So here, so I showed the combination of the message and several message and user classifiers. None here means that we drop the user classifier. What if we don't have any user classifier and we just have the message classifier? So here is the big picture of the framework for the message and the user classifier. So for example, doc2vec means that we have a fixed vector, and no2vec, it means that we have a fixed vector for the users. And then we are just optimizing the parameters of the classifiers. So for the experiment, still we use the same, we perform the experiments on the same data. We perform the experiment on Ask.fm, Instagram, and Twitter. We still have the seed of offensive word, and we have the seed of positive meaning words. We got these from a paper related to opinion mining. And these are some other settings we use for our framework. So again, we use the precision at K, and we just show the precision at K for all of the several message classifier that we used with respect to the message classifier. So we have the several combination of the message and user classifiers. So the first question is that what is the best combination? So we computed the precision at 100 for all of the combinations, and we realized that doc2vec, when combined with no2vec, and embedding message classifier when combined with no2vec user classifier, they are among the top 4 methods with the highest precision at. Okay, this is a question that many people might ask. So the other question is that does co-training help? It means that do we need user classifier at all? So in order to answer this question, we compute the precision at 100 when we have a user classifier, and again we compute the precision when we don't have any user classifier. We just have the message classifier. And if the difference is positive, it means that co-training help. So we have the higher precision. The red color is for Ask.fm. So for the Ask.fm, you see for all of the message classifier, co-training helps. And for the Instagram in the blue color, for majority of the message classifier, actually co-training help. But for the Twitter actual data set, we realized that only for one of the message classifier co-training, for the others, it's not helping. So based on our result, the conclusion would be, we could conclude that mostly in most cases, co-training help. So I just want to show some qualitative analysis, and one thing that I wanted to actually focus on explain is that we have false positive cases that it's not very easy to take care. So false positive, so there are some conversation, people are joking with each other, but they are not bullying each other. But our method identify these conversation as bullying. In order to take care of these kind of problems, we need to use more advanced natural language processing techniques. So far I talked about the next step, which was about the using nonlinear embedding model or nonlinear classifier for our framework. If you don't have any question, I can go to the next step that in our framework. For the next step, we try to reduce the discrimination or bias in our framework. So if you remember, I have this map of the words in the 2-dimensional vectors, but there are some issues in that, which is basically because of the discrimination in the social media, we have some words that because they co-occur with each other, their vectors or the mapping vectors, they are close to each other. And this caused the model to have discrimination in their predictions. So you can see here how co-occurrences that causes some words have similar embeddings, which is not good. This is not what we want. So we need to prevent this issue. So our method actually is similar to the Perspective API by Google Jigsaw because it assigned the toxicity of the conversation using machine learning models. So some researchers actually apply this method and they realize that there are some non-toxic conversation, but they have sensitive keywords. For these conversation, their model actually has a very high toxicity score. This is not ideal. So in our actually framework, we tried that and we didn't try that. Sorry. So in our framework, there were some conversations that they contain some sensitive keywords, but they are not bullying. But because of the discrimination, the framework gives this kind of conversation high a bullying score. So in order to take care of these kind of problems, we introduced the unfairness penalty term. So the idea is to penalize the model when we see discrimination in the prediction. So the first idea we had, we call this removal fairness. It means that the score of the sentence shouldn't decrease if we remove the sensitive keywords. If we remove the sensitive keywords and the score reduce, we penalize the objective function using this penalty term. So the other idea we had is a substitutional fairness. It means that for each category, like Muslim, like religion, we define some substitutes. For example, for the Muslim, we define some substitute. And then in the penalty term, the score of the message shouldn't change when we actually substitute substitute with replacement. So for example, if we in this message, if there are Muslim, if we substitute with the, for example, Christian, the score shouldn't change. If it changes, we penalize the objective function. So this is the basic idea for our how we approach this problem in order to reduce the discrimination. So for the experiment, for the evaluation, first of all, we construct the synthetic data. So in the synthetic corpus, actually, we collected all of the sensitive categories and all of the keywords in those categories. And then we combine all of them together. So we have a corpus of all of the sensitive keywords. These sentences, so you see here, they are not bullying, but they contain sensitive keywords. So if we add or enforce the fairness to the model, the ideal actually framework and non-biased or less biased framework should have less false positive rate. So we wanted to see when we enforce the fairness penalty term to the model, if the false positive rate reduce or not. And you see here, based on for all of the methods, the false positive rate reduces for when we enforce the substitution and removal fairness penalty term. So this is good. So this is what we actually wanted. So there are some, we have some other assessment, fairness assessment for our method. So we evaluate our method on Twitter data. So we extracted conversation containing at least one sensitive keywords, and then we ask annotators to rate if they are bullying or non-bullying conversation. So, and they consider it conversation bullying if majority of the annotators believe that they are bullying conversation. And then we define the category dispersion. So the category dispersion is a fairness evaluation criteria, so which is inspired from equality of odds. So the equality of odds, the idea is that all of the keywords in one category, they should have the same true or false positive rates. So for example, if imagine we have a race category. So in the race category, we have, or religion category, we have Muslim, Christian, or Jewish. So the idea is that the model should treat all of these keywords the same. So they should have lowered category dispersion. So this is a fair model, and this is not a fair model. This is an example. So on the Twitter data, we computed the category dispersion for all of the model in 3 targeted groups: race, religion, and sexual orientation. So the actually bullet point is this shows that when we enforce substitution, when we enforce fairness, the category dispersion reduces. It means that the model is fair toward this, all of the subcategories of sub keywords of the categories. So the main actual conclusion or the summary is that for the embedding message classifier and for the doc to vec, when combined with no to vec, when we enforce the substitutional fairness for all of these targeted groups, the category dispersion reduced. So the other question is about the accuracy. If we enforce the fairness penalty term, does the accuracy reduce or not? So we computed the area under the curve of this ROC curve, and with and without penalty term, fairness penalty term. So you see the vanilla is the blue color. So it means, so here you see that for this one, for the embedding, when we enforce penalty term, whatever removal or substitution, the accuracy does not reduce. But for this case, actually, you see that when we have enforced the removal penalty term, the accuracy reduces. So it's kind of very controversial if we add, when we are talking about the fairness in machine learning, how we want to just pay off the accuracy. So there are some qualitative analysis. So there are some, so here I just show some conversations. In this conversation, there are some sensitive keywords. After we enforce the penalty term, fairness penalty term, the Boolean score for this conversation reduces. So I just wanted to show some qualitative analysis. So in order to wrap up and big picture, so for this research in my during my PhD, so I introduced a weakly supervised machine learning. So in this weak supervision, we have a small seed of offensive or positive words. We feed these offensive words to the framework. Our framework consists of co-training. We look at the problem from 2 different perspectives. One is the language and the other is the social interaction, and they help each other in order to find the cyberbullying incident in social media. And then we try to reduce the discrimination in the prediction. So here is so the big picture. Actually, the bigger picture is that what is the next step after you define or identify the cyberbullying? Should you, for example, block the bully? Should you give some advice to the victim, or should we notify some human counselor? So there are some other scenarios that we can just take care by some sociological studies or some collaboration with other researchers in these areas. Okay, so I would like to pause a little bit before going to my research for postdoc. If you have any question or comments. Okay, can you hear me? Sorry, I'm wondering if I don't.
Yes, Elaheh, we hear you.
Yeah. Okay, great. So during my postdoc at Brown, I was working with the team. The project was learning with less label data. So while I was helping the team for example, for this research, I have my own research. Actually, it was this framework actually was a part of the big framework in the Brown team. So my work is image classification with limited labels. So many deep learning model requires a lot of data in order to train, but this is not possible for many applications. One of the applications that I was specifically interested in was fine-grained visual categorization. So for example, when you want to identify different species of birds or cats, these kind of problems are difficult because first of all, collecting data or taking picture of this kind of problem is not easy. And after you have data, annotating is not easy because you cannot find the experts, or even experts cannot easily annotate these kind of problems. So the common approach for these kind of problems is knowledge sharing. So you want to share the knowledge among related problems. So one idea about the knowledge sharing is transfer learning. So I'm talking about the deep learning model. So in the transfer learning, usually you have a pre-trained model on the source data, which is related to target data, and then you fine tune on the target data. Specifically, I'm talking about the deep learning model. The other schema for knowledge sharing is the multitask learning. So in the multitask learning, the goal is to improve the performance of all of the related tasks at the same time. So there are some benefits for the multitask learning. The first one is you implicitly increasing the amount of labeled data by the similar task. And the other is the regularization, because you enforce the inductive bias to the model, and it causes it actually reduce overfitting. So for example, the inductive bias is that the model prefer the hypothesis that can explain more than one task, and it actually helps generalization better. So for this research, we use learning with auxiliary data. So we have only two tasks. One is the target task with few amount of labeled data, and the other is the auxiliary task. But here we just care about the performance of the target task. We don't care about the auxiliary task. They are just helping for the target task. How we choose the auxiliary data, we use a semantic knowledge graph. So there are some semantic knowledge graphs such as ConceptNet. So in the ConceptNet, all of the concepts are related to each other using different types of relationships. So in this way, we extract all of the related data. So here is the big picture of the framework. So we have two tasks, target and source. So here, for example, this is the Oxford flower. And we have the convolutional neural network with shared parameters between two tasks. And then on top, we have two fully connected layers. One is for the target and the other is for the source task. So first of all, what we do is we join knowledge graph to the ImageNet. So we use ImageNet 14K. So it's the big source of the images, and then we connect all of the images or concept to the concept in the knowledge graph. So after that, we create or construct the auxiliary task based on the related API in the ConceptNet API. So for example, if one of the target classes is rows, we use this API in order to extract all of the related concepts. And then we construct the auxiliary, actually we construct the framework. So we have the shared parameter. CNN is shared for both tasks, for the target and the source task. And then target task parameters are updated only using the target classes, and the source task parameters are updated using source task. So the framework is very simple and straightforward. And here is the objective function, is the combination of the loss of the target and the loss of the source. And here the loss of the source is behaving as a regularizer. We don't care about the performance. So in order to update the parameters, first we update the model, both of the shared and the parameters of the fully connected based on the target task, and then we update the shared parameter and the source parameters using the source task. So we just repeat this process until convergence. So for the experiment, actually, we performed the experiment on 2 data sets, Oxford flower and cob data set. So you see that, for example, for Oxford flower, we have only 10 images per class. Or for cob, we have only 30 images per class. So the amount of images per class is not huge, but they are very much similar to each other. So for the baseline, the first baseline is fine-tuning. It means that you have the ResNet pre-trained on ImageNet, and then you fine-tune on these framework, and then the other baseline is random source task. It means that we are not using ConceptNet or knowledge graph in order to extract related data. We just randomly select some source task as auxiliary task. So there are 2 other methods similar to our method. One of them is selective job fine-tuning, so in which they find the auxiliary data based on the image by image similarity using KNN, which is computationally expensive. And the other is actually MetaFnet. So their framework, they require training on source task in order to learn what auxiliary data to select. So they have one more step comparing our method. So the results actually on Oxford flower and cob dataset, for both of them, the results were promising. So specifically, for example, this is our method. You see that it's not significant, but still for these hard problems, still we were actually, the results are really promising. So there are some challenges for this research that I was doing. So for example, so when you are talking about squash, so do you mean squash the sport or squash the fruit? Because we are using the ConceptNet or the knowledge graph, and the machine cannot distinguish between which one you are talking about. Or the other challenge, so for example, the other one is the nail. So are you talking about which nail you are talking about? So it means that when we are extracting the related data from knowledge graph, there are some unrelated information. And the next step for this research that I'm working on is how to reduce the effect of this non-related information, which is I guess is not that much straightforward. It's very challenging, but I can apply some reinforcement learning ideas and some of the self-supervised method in order to take care of this challenge. So in order to wrap up, I just introduced a very simple and straightforward method for image classification with less dependency on label data. So we have a convolutional neural network with shared parameters that is updated using both target and source tasks. We extracted the source task using the knowledge graph, and we trained the model using both of the target and source tasks all at the same time. Okay, so
I'm sorry, can I ask something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so in this model, were you also missing labels for your target task, or do you mean that you just had few samples per class you're trying to estimate?
I mean few samples. I don't have any missing label. I just okay. I mean that I have only, for example, here. Sorry. So here you see, so we have only 30 images per class. So okay. I don't have any. Yeah.
Okay, I thought you were going to talk about missing labels. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So actually, for this, I would like to add that for this framework, so we applied this framework on reinforcement learning using meta-learning approaches like MAML or something like that. So we applied this in one of the reinforcement learning application, and we got promising results. So it's very interesting, I guess, research direction for me. But in general, actually, I talk about my PhD thesis. I talk about what we have done during my postdoc at Brown. So you realize, you notice that my main research is about learning with less dependency on labeled data. So it can include semi-supervised learning when we have the combination of labeled and unlabeled data, using self-supervised learning. So I'm working on few-shot learning in the reinforcement learning application, and actually this framework that I introduced for my postdoc, we applied for few-shot and we got pretty good results. The other actually idea is that learning with weakly labeled data. So this research actually is the main team of the Brown team. So in the Brown team, the basic idea is that you have several weakly supervised label, and they are labeling the unlabeled data noisy. So the labels are noisy. And the main question is that how you take care of these noisy labeled data. Should you use the subset of these classifiers, or how you take care of those? So this is the main question in the Brown team. So one of those labelers was the framework I introduced, which is multitask learning. So the other research direction I'm very much interested is fairness in machine learning. So it's a very important topic, and I guess every machine learning or computer scientist should consider this line of research in his or her work. And the other is multi-view co-training. So so in the co-training, actually the basic idea is in the first co-training introduced, you try to divide all of the features into two sets of features. They are disjoint, and you have two classifiers that these two classifiers are training on these two features. And then you combine the prediction together. And it was introduced for the semi-supervised learning by Mitchell in CMU University. And if you notice, my PhD thesis was basically co-training. So we look at the problem from two perspectives. One is the message, and the other is the user classifier. And so, for example, the other research direction I'm very much interested in is integrating, for example, NLP and computer vision for many future tasks. There are many applications. So basically, I mean that I would like to continue my research in multi-view learning. So when you look at the problem in several directions, and then you ensemble and combine them all together. So all of these research are so kind of related. They are not totally separated to each other. Okay, so I guess, yeah, I'm done. So please give me your feedbacks, your comments, your questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Anybody has questions for Elaheh?
We can ask them later too, because we're going to talk to her after.
Okay, I actually have a question. So Elaheh, can you go back to your slide on offensive word scoring?
Okay.
Around 48. I had a question there as well. Around 48, it should be, I think.
Around 48. I just.
Yeah, okay. I think that's the table, right? Or no, later, I think.
Later, okay, 48, right? Okay.
This one, I guess you're talking about, or 46.
Okay.
No, Elaheh, what is, can you go back to your slide on scoring offensive words?
Okay, so I guess it was our first work.
Yes.
Okay, here, right?
Maybe even one more earlier.
One more earlier. Okay. So here is the
So my question is, an offensive word in America might not be offensive in another culture like the Middle East, and the other way around. How do you deal with that? Basically, each word has different connotation in different cultures.
That's true. Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. Actually, there are so many people ask me this question. So I mentioned here that these words, these seed words are defined by some experts. So the experts actually define what seed words could be. For this research, we just focus on the seed words that are collected based on the web page. But actually, your concern is totally right. So we could we didn't specifically look at the problem from this perspective, as you mentioned, that there are some seed words that are culturally. We just found some seed words from a web page that they define. They actually said that this is a offensive and negative words, and we realized that many researchers in cyberbullying detection, social media use this web page. But your concern is totally right that we didn't actually specifically focus on that direction.
So if we try to model culture, how can we actually include culture in your model? Or let me put it this way: is there a way to model culture and include it in your model?
Okay, so I guess there are some internet issues. So can you repeat your question? Sorry.
My question is there a way to include or model cultural context about word connotations in your model?
Like what?
Like as I said, any word that has dual connotations, one that's offensive in a Western culture and one that's less offensive in an Eastern culture, for example. And there is so many examples of that.
Yeah, this is actually a very interesting question. So yeah, so I haven't thought about with this perspective. So we just look at the seed words as just as you said in the American culture. So these words are defined in the in this web page that many cyberbullying researchers are just referring to that. But this is actually no, I haven't actually thought about that. I need to think about that.
Yeah, and the same thing also goes for fairness, because even the idea of fairness is too vague, and what could be fair in one culture might be not fair or biased in another culture. So this whole idea of modeling culture into or including culture in any machine learning model is something that I think might be of interest.
That's true. So I just thinking that, for example, if you want to apply this specific framework for your social media framework, or which is, for example, from the other country, so defining this seed is very important. So if you define the seed word based on your culture, the model will be trained based on your culture. So I would, for example, suggest that if people from different cultures wanted to apply this framework, and some words are offensive in some cultures and some other words are not, experts in some cultures can define these seed words. And then after that, they train the model. So in this case, the model would be more culture specific, and it could not be that much accurate for the other culture.
Mm-hmm.
This is my answer for this.
Okay. I actually have another question in the chat window. I'll read it for you. The question is it possible to leverage this model to anticipate bullying that's new and emergent? For example, anti-Asian bullying due to COVID prejudice. Can you leverage this model to anticipate bullying that's new and emerging?
So bullying. So what was the COVID-19 for this one?
The COVID-19 is an example of new and emerging types of cyberbullying. Basically, the Chinese virus or the Chinese people are the source of COVID. This is what you see now on many social network platforms, the China virus. The question is it possible to use your model to anticipate or detect emerging and new types of cyberbullying?
Okay, this is a very, very interesting question. So basically, the base idea for this research is a seed words. If we don't have COVID-19 related or Chinese cyber for using these words, these kind of keywords, this framework, I don't think that is able to detect this kind of new concept of bullying, because because our expert provides some other seed words.
Okay.
Then, in order to take care of that, we need to update the seed words and fine-tune or retrain this framework. But this is actually a very interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I had one question as well, which relates to the question Wael just asked before. So later in your model, you said you define basically a bunch of words that you believe that some models have bias towards. You mentioned like gay, black, and so forth, which you don't consider as bullying. So isn't that a way? Isn't what you did basically a bias towards the knowledge of, like, maybe a Western civilization where these words are not considered as bullying? So maybe in an Eastern civilization as well, mentioned, some of these words might be considered as bullying. In a Western civilization, they're not, maybe. So later on, you said that you tried to remove that bias, but by adding a bias that these words are not offensive. So my question is, how do you select these words that are not offensive? Again, from general knowledge of the public and voters, or how do you choose those words that are not supposed to be bullying, and you try to bias your model against that?
So for this one, we have some collaboration with sociology department for this research for cyberbullying detection in social media. So let me just go quickly to the slide. So I guess you are talking about
where you basically either replacing the word with some other word,
right,
or
right.
you were yes.
Yeah, so we have some collaboration with we had some collaboration with sociology department, and based on that, we asked them, and they provide these kind of keywords, sensitive keywords with substitutions. So it was
right, but my question is, like, you're basically taking the bias of your original data and you're trying to remove it. And I'm wondering what would be the difference if this was removed from the original training data. Like, these words, they don't receive a high score anymore. So maybe Jewish, Christian, Mormon, atheist, all these words do not have a bad connotation anymore in your original data. So it's like you're trying to use a data set that has data that is biased, and you're trying to remove the bias by adding knowledge which is biased.
okay.
Because other people said that these words are not basically bullying. They don't constitute bullying. You understand what I mean?
So I understand what you, but I don't understand the question. So your questions, if I understand, is that, for example, if Muslim, when in sentence has the Muslim, the bullying score is high. And when there is a Christian, the bullying score is low, right? So after we apply this fairness, how the score changes when there's Muslim and Christians in the board, right?
I understand, but what I'm saying is if you knew in advance that Muslim does not have a bad connotation,
Okay.
why don't you just change the score in your original data and say, you know, in your original data, I don't want Muslim to have a bad connotation. So you're basically taking a biased data set because it has these words have bad connotation, and you're trying to remove this bad connotation by another biased data set where someone told you that this does not have a bad connotation. So what would be the difference if the original data set did not, these words had changed? You could remove the Muslim from a bad connotation dictionary, for example. This is what I mean. This is my understanding, that basically you're taking biased data and you're putting it into other biased data. Like you're unbiased based on bias.
Yeah, but the point is that the social media data is biased. And there are some bias in social media data that we, as a research scientist, I don't want to touch or change the data. I want to change the model. So it's not the word that the only Muslim word. The problem is that the words that co-occur with the Muslim, the offensive or negative words. So in that, I understand your question, and I think that it's complicated. In order to change the data, it's more complicated than changing the model. But I guess I understand your question. So
it's just a little bit, you know, that, as I said, you know, it's like you're trying to debias something, but with biased information from other people now. So, you know, if you had originally collected your data from the other people, this bias would not be there.
That's true. Or for example, for industry cases or some other applications, so you already have your model, your data. So that would be complicated. But how about just changing the framework?
Yeah. Okay.
But this is a controversial, actually. I read some papers and people were introducing changing the data as well. Yeah, that's true.
Right. I mean, this is basically what you're doing, though, through a model. You're changing the scoring of things based on other knowledge that it's also, someone could also say this is controversial, like this word should not be considered as, you know, bullying, or it should be considered as bullying.
Okay. Yeah, it's based on our previous bias.
I understand what you're saying, but yeah.
Thanks, Elaheh. I guess we're a little bit over time, and I know other people have other meetings. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation.